Okay, so this lesson is on the RFP process, something that may cause dread, anxiety, angst for folks who have gone through this before. It is one of the more bureaucratic aspects of working in the sled market, and in all honesty, it can certainly be frustrating and challenging. That said, they are a reality. RFPs are a reality. You will be responding to RFPs if you want to be successful in SLED. And there are things you can do to improve the RFP process overall, to perform better, to learn from your mistakes, and to set yourself up for higher win rates. So, by the end of this session, you will understand why governments use RFPs to procure their goods and services. You will know the full life cycle of an RFP from the very beginning to the very end. It's more than what you may know of right now. It's much longer than most people think. You'll also learn how governments evaluate RFP responses. And as a result, we'll give you some tips on what you can do to really make your proposal stand out amongst competitors. And then lastly, I hope to give you some good information on how you can learn and grow from lost opportunities. You're not going to win every single RFP response that you submit. You shouldn't win every single RFP response that you submit. But when you do lose, it's important to take advantage of opportunities to learn and grow so that you're continuing to improve. Okay, what's the deal with RFPs? Well, we'll get into that just a minute, but first, let's take a look at some of these acronyms because it's not just RFPs that you see. And all of these are begin with the RF, which stands for request for, and they're essentially formal documents that are released by a government or any other agency. It's not just governments that use RFPs and RFIs and RFQs, but you will see them most frequently or very frequently from government entities. So what you may see out there are RFIs, RFQs, and RFPs. Now, RFIs typically stand for Request for Information. And that is something that a government puts out when they are looking for information about an issue or a challenge or something they may need to procure later down the line. They're trying to get information about what they might need to do to address a problem, and they're looking for information from folks in the private sector primarily, but also maybe in the nonprofit, the education sector, universities, things like that. They're trying to get information about how they can go about solving a problem, and they're putting that into a formal request asking different groups to submit information, right, to provide information about how they would address an issue or a challenge. RFQ, I've actually seen this stand for two different things. Request for quote, which is just like it sounds, a quote. Often this will be for something that is maybe a commodity or something like that, where you can give a basic price for amount of some sort of good. And then request for qualifications. So this is something you see more in the consulting sector where the government is looking to put together a project. They're trying to figure out who may be able to do that, and they're going to ask for qualifications from different firms to show that they are qualified to provide the services that the government is looking for. And then the most common thing that you will see, and the thing we're really talking about today, is the request for proposal. So the request for proposal is a formal procurement document where the government has decided they need to purchase goods or services, and they are going to use a formal procurement process in order to do so. And they are asking private sector and other folks to submit proposals for how they would address the challenge and provide the services or goods that the government is requesting. So one thing we should note here is that a request for information typically does not directly involve a contract, right? There's not usually going to be an evaluation or a winner for an RFI. The government is using it to collect information. Request for quote may or may not, same thing with a request for qualifications, they may or may not end with a contract. There may be a winner, there may not be. It's sort of ambiguous. I've seen it both ways. I've seen RFQs released that then awarded a winner, but not always. RFPs, on the other hand, almost always end with a winner, unless, of course, they say that they choose not to select any winner um, of the submission. But for the most part, RFPs end with a winner and a contract with a vendor. So, not all products are purchased via RFPs. That's important to know, right? There are a lot of products, a lot of services that governments will purchase without going through the RFP process. But if the procurement is of a certain dollar value, and that dollar value varies, and can vary quite a bit from place to place, but if it meets a certain threshold, you're going to see an RFP. And any large deal that you do with a government is most likely going to go through the RFP process. So the way this works is that, and the reason RFPs, the reason governments and SLED entities use RFPs is because they're trying to compare vendors and evaluate different options to ensure they receive the best solution to the challenge they are trying to address. And the reason they do this is because at their core, governments, when it comes to spending, they are risk averse and they're also altruistic. And so, what I mean by that is governments are risk averse when spending money because that money is taxpayer dollars. And that really does mean a lot to governments. They want to be careful with how they spend taxpayer dollars. When something goes wrong with a purchase, they hear about it. It can end up in the newspaper. You can have people show up at your meeting and yell at you. It can be turned into a scandal, right? So they are going to be risk averse with taxpayer dollars. They're also altruistic, right? And what I mean by that is they really do care about their community, about their residents. They want to put those taxpayer dollars to good use. Um, Government employees don't go into this for the money, right? You don't go into public service for the money. You go into it because you find it interesting. You want to help your community. So government buyers are risk averse. They're altruistic, and using RFPs is a way to help them de-risk their purchase and their spending of public funds, of taxpayer dollars. So that's a reason you see RFPs more frequently in the public sector than you do in the private sector. All right, so now let's get into the RFP lifecycle. And this is going to sort of serve as the foundation for the remainder of this lesson. We're going to go through each aspect that you see here in this RFP lifecycle and take a in-depth look at each step along the way. So, I laid out a number of steps in the RFP lifecycle. They're not necessarily connected to a specific time frame. This life cycle can happen on shorter or longer terms. Generally speaking, I'd say the overall life cycle runs anywhere from 12 to 18 months on average, and they can certainly be both shorter or longer. But if you go up to the top left corner, that is the place that I like to think of as the catalyst. That is where the RFP life cycle begins. The next phase of the RFP life cycle is information gathering, followed by posting, where they're actually disseminating an RFP, looking to get submissions. Then they collect the information, they evaluate proposals and submissions to the RFP. They may interview the finalists that they have selected from those submissions. And then when they've chosen a finalist, the proposal is then presented, and the winner is presented to a council or a board for approval. After that point, there will be a recommendation or an intent to award, and then eventually there are contract negotiations. So that's sort of the high-level view of the RFP life cycle, but let's go through and look at it step by step. So the catalyst is the cause of the RFP. It's the thing that triggers an RFP. It's what makes the government realize, hey, we need to purchase something, and we're likely going to need to release an RFP in order to purchase the thing, whether it's a good or service, product, whatever, to solve the issue and address the challenge or initiative that we're looking to address. So there are a number of different things that can be an RFP catalyst, a number of different things that can trigger an RFP. One of the most common is an initiative by the county, by the city, the school, whatever. Initiative that is brought by maybe a council member or a mayor, and they have determined that they are going to use some funds in the budget to address that initiative. That is absolutely a very common cause, a very common catalyst for an RFP to end up taking shape. Federal or state grant money funding that comes through. Oftentimes, cities, counties, schools, they are awarded a fund. And as a result, that fund is going to allow them to take some action to purchase services in order to address a challenge in their community. And so receiving that funding is very frequently a catalyst for an eventual RFP. State mandates, funded or unfunded mandates, right? Sometimes the state comes in and says, hey, local governments, you have to do this. You have to comply with this new law or regulation. And oftentimes, in order to do that, the city, county, local government is going to have to procure services or products in order to meet the requirements of the newly passed mandates. And so that is another common RFP catalyst. Contract expirations, right? There's an existing contract that's going to expire. They're likely going to go out to a new RFP in order to either extend that contract or open it up for a larger competition and see if maybe they bring in a new vendor. Contract termination doesn't happen often, but it certainly can happen where a vendor who has a contract does not meet their obligations, the contract is terminated, and the government may then go back out to RFP. Capital plan updates. They develop a capital plan, determine they need to build a new school or maybe a new city hall. That something is certainly going to catalyze the RFP process and result in probably multiple RFPs. And demographic changes, that's another one. Changes to the community, introduce new challenges, new things, new services that the government has to address. And so those things can also be an RFP catalyst. And then lastly, employee turnover. When employees retire, sometimes the government may not necessarily look to bring in a new employee. They may rather see if they can contract those services out. And when doing so, they would likely release an RFP. So the point is, there are a lot of different things that can happen to catalyze, to trigger an eventual RFP. And those catalysts are important to be aware of, because by understanding what types of things can trigger RFPs, you can put yourself in front of governments before an RFP is released, knowing that some sort of action or something has taken place that's likely to lead to an RFP coming down the pike. Okay, so information gathering. If a government realizes that they are going to be putting out an RFP, they usually assign some member of their staff to start figuring out, okay, what do we need to do here? What does an RFP that is meant to address this challenge look like? What type of information do we need to put in that RFP? And so when they do that, you have a government employee who's been assigned. They're typically not an expert in this area. They start doing research. They start gathering information about the potential solutions to the issue they're dealing with that they will then use to write up the specs and everything else that they'll put into the RFP, the scope of work and so forth. So, where do they go to get this information? Well, one of the first places they go is the place everybody goes to get any information, which is the internet, right? So they are going to go out and do web research to try and learn a little bit about the issue that they're dealing with and learn a little bit about the other vendors and companies that can help them solve the issue or address the challenge they're facing. They'll probably look for similar RFPs, right? That's something that's just natural, right? It makes it's common sense. So they're going to look and see, are there other RFPs that have been released, maybe recently, maybe in nearby communities, and what have they put? What have they done in their RFPs to procure certain goods or services to address the challenge that they're facing? They'll reach out to vendors. They will directly call vendors that they see as maybe thought leaders in the space that their RFP is working in, and they'll ask. They'll frankly say, we're putting together an RFP to address an issue, and we see that you've done this type of work in the past. What do we need to do? What do we need to put into our RFP? Again, neighboring communities, they want to see, if a neighboring community put out a similar RFP in the past, they're going to call them up. They may not even be a neighboring community. They may reach out to anybody who's put out a similar RFP, and they'll call them up and they'll ask a number of things. They'll ask, who did you work with? How did they do? Who else submitted? Who was on your short list? What were the proposals like? What were the requirements? What was the scope that you included? And then lastly, membership associations, right? If this is the city, they might reach out to their local state league or maybe the National League of Cities even, and get their advice. Say, hey, do you know any other cities who have, or counties or whatever, who have had this challenge and put out our similar RFPs? We want some information to figure out what needs to go into RFP. What can we expect for, budgeting and that sort of stuff. So after a government has collected all of the information to put into an RFP, they write the RFP, and then they need to post it. They need to disseminate that RFP out so that vendors can find it and submit and tell them, this is our proposal to address this challenge that you're dealing with, to provide the goods or services that you are looking to procure. And when a government posts an RFP, they will typically work with a vendor to disseminate that RFP all over the web, right? So companies can find it. And there are a lot of companies. You see, this is just a small sampling of the companies that provide procurement services, and more so than just procurement services, they provide RFP dissemination service, right? Getting that RFP out into the public eye so that private sector companies can find them and post their submissions. There are a ton of these companies that do this. What's important to note is that I don't think any of them, in fact, I'm quite certain that none of them capture every RFP. They never do. No one's ever had I've never heard of any one of these companies that's able to capture every single RFP that's out there. It just doesn't happen. The market's too fragmented. It's all over the place. There's a lot of RFPs that go out. It's pretty common to subscribe to one of these so that you can reference RFPs and take stock of what RFPs are going out in the marketplace. But if you ask me, it never makes sense to subscribe to more than one of these RFP dissemination services, because frankly, what you want to do is respond to the RFPs that you already know are coming. But we'll talk more about that in future presentations. But it's just important to know that there are a lot of different companies that disseminate RFPs. You may find yourself registering on lots of different sites in order to submit RFPs. But this is, the third or fourth step here in this process. That governments, they post their RFPs to one of these different sites or some other one that's not listed. You'll also find those RFPs frequently on their own website and so forth. So after a government has submitted an RFP, they're going to collect the responses, collect the proposals that vendors have submitted. Now, if you are a vendor and you have written an RFP proposal, a submission, and you are submitting it, the government is collecting those proposals. This is the place where it is just critical that you follow every single rule that you find in the RFP. Follow it to a T. So some of the things you're going to really need to pay attention to is, do they require a hard copy to also be sent? Sometimes you have to submit both an online copy and a hard copy and have it mailed and have it reach the office at a very specific date and time. Don't ever miss that date and time. If you miss the time even by a second, you may very well lose your opportunity to submit the proposal. Are you a registered vendor? Sometimes you have to be registered in the city to submit a proposal. That's usually not a difficult thing to do, but make sure you've done it. Insurance requirements. There are often insurance requirements and proof of insurance that you'll have to submit with a proposal, so make sure you've done that. Pricing sheets requirements. There are often very specific rules regarding how you can submit the cost portion of your proposal. Make sure you follow those. And then lastly, there's often a no contact period. So, where after you have submitted your proposal, you are not allowed to contact anyone from the vendor. Sometimes it's, might be natural instinct to want to send a follow up like a week later after you submitted your proposal. Don't do it, especially if it specifically calls out that you should not do it in the RFP. So it's really important to make sure you follow all of these rules, and you'll see why just here on the next slide. So after all these proposals, all these submissions to the RFP have been collected, the government then needs to evaluate them. And the first step in evaluating RFP submissions is seeing if you follow the rules. And again, there are a lot of rules related to RFPs. So they're going to check, did you submit it on time? Did you complete all the required documents? If there was prescribed formatting or structure guidelines for your response, which most of the time there is, did you meet all of those? Did you satisfy every requirement as it was described in the RFP? Now, this is before anyone takes into account the content, the cost, any of this. They're trying to determine if you followed the rules. And if you didn't follow all the rules exactly as required, there's a good chance no one's ever going to read that proposal that you worked so hard on, right? This can be really frustrating, but it's also something that you can make sure you do, right? These rules, it can be a little bit confusing, but there's no real excuse to not meet all of these requirements that are always, explicitly described in the RFP. And when you have a situation where government's got to read, say 20 different proposals and they're all 50 pages long, it's only natural to look for reasons to start whittling down the field. So if you messed up and didn't follow the rules to a T, there's a good chance you're going to get ruled out before anyone's even read that proposal. So just to reemphasize, make sure you follow the guidelines. They'll all be there for you in the RFP. Follow them to a T. Don't screw up at this part. All right. So step 2 of evaluating the proposal is scoring, right? So proposal evaluation is usually done by a selection committee. The selection committee is going to be comprised of staff members of the government. And they're usually staff members that have some sort of stake in the procurement. So these could be users of the product or service. Oftentimes, if you're tech, it's going to be, you might find a member of the IT team there, community relations. That's often a big piece because many, government related RFPs have a community aspect, right? They have some sort of impact on the community, on the residents. And so there may be somebody from the community relations, community engagement team as well. But it's a diverse group of staff members, some who may have some expertise in the area, some who may not. And they will form the selection committee. They will evaluate your responses, your proposals, according to a scoring rubric that explains exactly how they're going to score these proposals. And that rubric is pretty much always listed in the RFP itself. So you'll have an understanding before you submit about the rules the selection committee will be following and how they will be scoring your proposals. So, to give you an idea of what that looks like, this is an example taken from an actual RFP. And you can see that they list the selection criteria. And this is extremely common. This will be in almost every RFP you respond to. And I want to call out a few things here, and they're highlighted. So one is it explains the RFP will be evaluated using a point system with a selection committee comprised of city staff. As I explained previously, that is the typical approach, the typical way these things are scored. The fee proposals you see at the top of the second paragraph. This is something to pay attention to. Fee proposals will not be reviewed at the initial evaluation. After initial evaluation, the city will determine the top proposals and only open those fee proposals. The city will then determine which, if any, firms will be interviewed. So that line right there is really something I want to stress, which is that the fee proposal, and this is very common, is not reviewed until after the scoring and the determination of finalists has been made based upon the other criteria in the submission. So, when I talk to people about RFPs and doing work with government, you always hear like, oh, they're just going to take the lowest bidder. And that is very, very rarely true. It does happen, sure, it certainly does happen, but it's not common. It's the exception rather than the rule. The rule, what happens more often, is what you see described here, where the fee proposal isn't even looked at unless the submission has been deemed, worthy of being a finalist, right? So, that is very much a myth that RFPs just go to the lowest bidder. Again, that's just really not the case. Sure, it can happen, but it's not common. Another thing I want to mention here is that at the last paragraph that's highlighted, all proposals submitted may be subject to clarifications and further negotiation. All agreements resulting from negotiations that differ from what is represented within the RFP or proposal response shall be documented and included as part of the final contract. So, that's rather wordy and maybe a little bit tough to decipher. But what it really means is that they are offering some flexibility, right? They are looking for creativity. They're looking for suggestions as to the best way to address the problem. They're not necessarily saying, we know exactly what needs to be done. You have to follow our scope exactly as written. No, they are open to suggestion. They're open to expertise. And that's another thing you'll frequently see in these RFPs. As bureaucratic and rigid as they can be, they also are written by humans, and they're written by humans that often realize they are not the experts. And so if you find language that lends itself to allowing flexibility in the response, take advantage of it. Be creative, be interesting. It doesn't have to be just because it's bureaucratic, just because it's rigid, doesn't mean there can't be persuasion and creativity involved, right? So look for opportunities for flexibility in RFPs and use those to your advantage to convey why your solution is the best solution. And then, lastly, just note the scoring rubric here. You'll see this in just about every RFP where they lay out how it's going to be judged, what areas they'll be judging, how many points they're allotting to each area. Note that D is the fee proposal. It's provided 20 points, which is the least number of points, although tied with the professional qualifications. And that's another thing you're going to see. You're going to see how much that fee proposal is worth. And frankly, for me, if the fee proposal gets some sort of number of points that's just not in sync with the rest, or is much higher than the rest of the components they're looking for, I'm just not going to apply. I'm not going to submit that RFP. That's not worth it to me. So it's something you'll know going in, and just be on the lookout. But yeah, it's always helpful to know that all of that information is there. You know how it's going to be judged before you ever submit. So let's say you've submitted an RFP and you've been selected as a finalist. There's a good chance, although not always the case, but there's a good chance you will then be interviewed by that selection committee. So the key to the interview is that everything's already public, right? You have an RFP, you likely know who else was selected as a finalist, or if you don't know, you can find out. It's often discussed during a sort of public board meeting where you can find meeting minutes on their website and so forth. But all of the information you need to really ace that interview is out in the public already. So do your effing research, right? You treat this like a job interview. And you don't go into a job interview just winging it. No, you do research. You figure out what is likely to resonate with your audience. And in this environment, you have an incredible opportunity to do that because so much information is public. So it's really important to do your research, come into these interviews prepared. Frequently, they'll list and they'll give you the questions they're going to ask you ahead of time. I always recommend putting it into a presentation, even if they don't ask for that. Putting the questions on a slide and then writing out your answer and presenting on your answer to each question. But everything is public. Do your research. If you get an interview, ace the interview. There's really no excuse not to. After you've taken my advice and done your research and aced the interview, and you've been selected by the selection committee to be the vendor that they're going to use and that has won this RFP, the selection committee will take the recommendation to go with you to the council or board for approval. So, a few things to note about this. First off, you might be asked to attend. Um, it's not all that common, but it certainly does happen. And you can usually attend virtually. You may want to attend in person, especially if it's a very large contract. But you're not necessarily going to be heavily involved in that process. It may be, and most often is, a matter of simply introducing yourself. If you have a council member or mayor who happens to be knowledgeable in the area that you're working in, they may ask you a few questions. But it's very rare for a council or board to deny and to go against the recommendation or the recommended vendor from the selection committee. This is, generally speaking, this portion of the RFP process is kind of a rubber stamp, right? This is more a formality than anything you really need to be nervous about. For the most part, when you have been recommended as the vendor by the selection committee, you're very likely, probably, greater than 95% chance of winning and actually, having that contract go through. But it is important to make sure that you meet any deadlines related to the public meeting. And public meetings often have very rigid deadlines in terms of submitting materials that will be presented during that meeting. So if you have to provide a summary or anything for the council or board meeting where they'll be approving your contract or approving your recommendation, the intent to award, you should make sure that you know exactly what those deadlines are and you are submitting everything you need to in order to meet those deadlines. And then, again, everything's public. Research the council, the board, the mayor. It doesn't have to be extensive, but if you do happen to be going to a meeting where the mayor has a background in the area you work and they might ask you more pointed questions, it's good to know that, right? It's helpful to be prepared. So do a little research on the board members, the mayor, before you go to one of these meetings. Okay, intent to award. So that's what happens after the counselor board has approved the selection committee's recommendation of a vendor. You're then given an intent to award, and at this point, you've won, right? You have won that RFP, and congratulations. you're now going to work on signing the contract. And this is where city, county, school, they might bring in their procurement office, but not every SLED entity has a procurement office. So it may just be like a clerk or a city attorney, and you're going to get into the nitty gritty details of the contract. Now, it's pretty rare for things like cost to ever have any wild adjustments at this point in the project. Um, it's usually around the use of internal staff sources, services, or timelines, maybe certain reimbursements for travel. But it's pretty rare that at this point the contract negotiations are related to large sums of money. They're usually more technical details that, they can sometimes take a little time to get worked out, but they almost always get worked out. Now, the RFP process is long, as you've seen here, and it can be really, really frustrating when you go through the RFP process. You do everything right, you do really good, and then you lose. Right? You maybe get all the way through an interview and you lose. You're shortlisted and then you lose. It can be so frustrating, but if you're working in the space long enough, it's going to happen. And so it's important to not necessarily get discouraged, but to take advantage of the fact that you went through the process and you did well. You did things. There are learning opportunities here. There's marketing opportunities here. So what should you do if you went all this way and then you lost? Well, technically you do have an option to protest the award to a different vendor. However, I would not recommend doing that really ever. It's got to be really extraordinary circumstances for you to protest an award. The last thing you want to do is get the reputation as a vendor who protests anytime they don't win. You're going to shoot yourself in the foot by doing that. So I really never recommend protesting. Again, maybe there's some sort of extraordinary circumstance or something. For the most part, you really should not be protesting when you lose an RFP response. But what you can do and what you're entitled to do is ask for a debrief. So a debrief means that you'll sit down with a member from the selection committee usually and go through, how you did, what gave somebody else, the win instead of you, and that can be really helpful to get some candid insight about where you need to improve. I wouldn't do this all the time. It's time consuming both for you and for the government, but it's certainly valuable. So be judicious, but do it every now and again, and use it as a way to learn about the response you submitted. So, and then look on the bright side, right? If you submitted a strong proposal and you didn't win, but you were maybe shortlisted, and you've got you put a great foot forward. These cities, counties, schools, they all talk to each other, right? They talk to their neighbors, and if you submitted a good proposal, the next time an RFP comes out, as we mentioned earlier in the information gathering stage, these cities, they call up their neighbors, they call up other communities that have put out these RFPs, and they ask, who sent the proposals and were they good? And even if you didn't win, but put a great proposal, there's a good chance that might even end up they may even take language from that proposal in the next RFP they put out, right? So there's a really good opportunity here to get some word of mouth marketing simply by putting in a strong proposal to an RFP, even if you don't win. And it's a learning opportunity, right? You have an opportunity to figure out what didn't work and where you can improve. And when you develop an RFP proposal, when you develop a response to an RFP, the exercise leads to the creation of a ton of great marketing material. So don't just submit a proposal and then forget about all that content that you developed in writing that. No, use that, turn it into blog posts, put it on social media, take chunks out of it, and turn it into a webinar or something, right? There's a lot of good content you get simply by responding to an RFP. So don't let that stuff go to waste. And so that's it. We have gone through the full life cycle of the RFP. all the way from the catalyst event that sort of triggers an RFP to come out to hopefully winning that contract. But even if not winning, losing and understanding what you can do to take some good from that loss. So RFPs, again, they can sort of cause dread and angst, and I get it. I've written a lot of proposals, and it could be super frustrating, uh, really stressful at times. But if you think about it the right way and understand what is likely coming down the pike in terms of the RFP, it can be really important. One thing I do want to mention, and I'm actually just going to go back real quick to the RFP lifecycle. And we'll discuss this again, but just real quick. It's really important that your first contact in the RFP lifecycle is not at this point. It is not at the collection of the proposals with the client. That's further down the line of the RFP's lifecycle that you want to be. When you first have contact with a potential client or a client is putting out an RFP, you really want it to be here, right? At the point where they're collecting information. You want to be somebody who's helping to inform the way they write their RFP. So, again, we're going to talk about this quite a bit more in the next session and the session after that. But I do want to call it out here. So, with that, I will wrap things up. And this is the RFP process, and hopefully, you've learned quite a bit and won't dread RFPs quite as much as you did before going through this lesson. Thank you.